June 16th and 17th, 1775. Ladies and gentlemen, Massachusetts, which technically, if you want to be really honest and you really pay attention to some of the questions, New England is beginning to support their own buddy. Even though we say Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire are becoming more and more loyal to Massachusetts. Remember when we did the Albany plan and the head said New England? New England does whatever Massachusetts does. Rhode Island and Connecticut are beginning to show more and more support. On June 16th and June 17th, we are about to have a major incident. The incident will be known as Bunker Hill. By its very definition, it is the stupidest name of all time. Does anybody remember, can anyone tell me, and has anybody read, what is wrong with the Battle of Bunker Hill? Ladies and gentlemen, for the last 200 years, the battle has been referenced to the Battle of Bunker Hill. There is a hill outside of Boston called Bunker. However, the entire engagement, the entire incident takes place at a different hill, okay, called Breed Hill. So actually, what we are going to have is the Battle of Breed Hill. Here's what happens. On the 16th, the colonial militia, led by a man named Prescott, is going to capture and occupy Breed and Bunker Hill. What is the big deal? Breed and Bunker Hill are the hills kind of surrounding Boston Harbor. If you have never been to Boston, Boston kind of looks like a big sea. Basically the harbor is kind of surrounded. There's land all the way around it, and the land around the harbor kind of raises up on these kind of hilltops. What is the significance? The colonists had captured Bunker and Breed Hill. If they could bring artillery, if they could bring cannons to Breed Hill, cannons could be placed on the hill, and they could potentially threaten and endanger the British Navy in Boston Harbor. If you have never studied or spent much time on history, please understand, the rise and power of England has always been based on the strength of their navy. The English are very, very cautious of their navy and anything that could threaten or damage it. To the British Army, correct. Remember, the colonists did get cannon. General Gage, by the name of General Howe, to destroy the colonial army and capture the hill. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British want to capture, secure the hill. Technically, it's called Breed Hill, even though it's called Bunker in every book you'll ever look at. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, General William Howe, on June 16th, will take the British Army and somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 British soldiers to capture the hill. The colonial army, you can put question marks. What I'm about to tell you should make sense. We will go back to what was said over there. Remember the propaganda word. Colonists will say that they had 300 men. The British, why would there be such a discrepancy? I mean, think about it. When you fight the enemy, after the battle, you want to make your enemy sound like. In fact, haven't you guys ever seen that with hurricanes? Quite often. I mean, even when we have tornadoes, I mean, the weathermen originally portray it out worse. I mean, oftentimes with a hurricane, they begin to speculate there could be thousands of casualties. And in the end, there's 58. I'm not trying to say that 58 casualties is not horrific and tragic, but they often over-speculate because it gets more what? It gets more attention, it gets more hype. That is what we do today. We use, in journalism, we often use the very petty and oftentimes even inaccurate information. So here we go. General Howe is going to attack, technically on the 17th, Breed Hill. Ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of Breed Hill is one of the most controversial battles of the war. General Howe will launch 3 direct assaults on the hill. Basically, the British are at the bottom. On 3 attempts, they are going to charge up the hill. Twice, the colonial militia repels the British attack and defends the hill. What you might want to be aware of is in the 3rd attack, the British succeed. Ladies and gentlemen, the British captured Breed Hill. In fact, not only did the British capture Breed Hill, when they get to the top, the militia has primarily run away. They have retreated. They took off. They're a bunch of cowards. Clearly, at this moment, this does not seem all that impressive. From the British standpoint, they captured the hill, and they defeated an army, in their words, that was significantly larger. Folks, that would be in an English newspaper. Colonial perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, what's the number one thing the colonists are going to point out? This is a standing line formation. What did the British argued and argued and argued? A militia cannot fight against an army. A militia cannot stand their ground. The militia argues we stood against the British army, which was larger than us, and we inflicted 1,000 casualties compared to 400. We beat the snot out of them. Now let's go a little bit farther. The colonists argue we did not get beaten. We were forced to retreat because we did not have any more bullets. We simply ran out of supplies, and we do not have bayonets. Bayonets, for those of you who do not know, of course, are the swords or knives you put on the end of a rifle, and you make it into a spear. For those of you who are having trouble, the colonists are militia. They use their gun for what purpose? Hunting. Do you understand that a bayonet has absolutely no practical purpose in this world? Ladies and gentlemen, if you are a frontiersman, you probably have a knife, but there's no purpose to put a bayonet. The odds of you standing in a tree and jumping down on a deer are pretty small. The odds of a herd of squirrels coming up upon you and needing your bayonet to fight them off are pretty small. My point, a bayonet is a military weapon. For those of you who do not know, does anybody know the original bayonets are what shape? They're triangles. Does anybody know what happens if you cut yourself with a blade or something like a knife? But you bleed, but what happens, the wound is, if it's a slice, the wound is designed to heal. The reason you use a triangle is your body is not designed to heal that shape. Triangles are designed, the purpose of it is to make a wound. For those of you who don't understand, a bayonet is poke, twist. That way we get all the organs and gunk hooked on and yank. Colonists do not have them. Think about it. If you get to hand-to-hand combat, the bayonets at this time are oftentimes 8, 9, 10 inches long. It gives them a spear tip, and it makes them much longer when you get into the hand-to-hand. Folks, look at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The biggest thing you want to notice is you have a completely different perspective of the battle. The British are going to argue that it was an absolute victory for the British. They captured the hill, they secured their objective, and the enemy ran away. The colonists argue that we outfought. We literally beat the enemy, and the only reason we were forced to run away, we did not have the proper supplies. And of course, what is England, or what is Massachusetts trying to argue? If the rest of you would help us, if we would have had more men, if we would have had the proper supplies, we wouldn't have had to run away. Please be absolutely clear. Massachusetts is going to argue that Bunker Hill is proof that militias can beat an army. This is the battle that Massachusetts is going to basically cling to that is proof that England can be beaten. Why? Folks, this was not guerrilla tactics. This was not small hit-and-run tactics, on the roadside. This was two large armies lined up in standing line formation, and the colonists did not break apart and run. The colonists would argue they had to make a retreat because of lack of equipment. Think about it. If the colonists had proper supplies, they would have simply killed the British all day long. Remember, to the British, the number of dead didn't matter. The British Army is a standard traditional army. The only thing that mattered to the British is they captured the objective. The objective was the hill. Now let's do it from another perspective. Please identify. The colonists could go one step further. The hill is worthless. Why? Because they didn't have the cannons. The British lost 1,000 men acquiring an objective the colonists couldn't use. So please understand, when you look at the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British will dismiss it as a victory. The colonists will argue this is the absolute definitive proof the British are not invincible. Back to the Second Continental Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, the next item is called the Olive Branch Petition. Massachusetts is going to use Lexington and Concord and Ticonderoga. They are going to use Bunker Hill, and they are convinced the other 13 colonies to support us. And ladies and gentlemen, after debate and whining and all of this stuff, this is what they come up with. Make no mistake, the other 12 counties are very afraid. The other 12 counties are beginning to feel that England is becoming a tyrant. This is the proposal. For those of you who do not get it, Massachusetts lost the argument. This is the olive branch. The decision is made that the 13 counties are going to write a piece of paper, and the piece of paper is basically going to beg. It is going to plead King George to stop the violence. The 13 counties together sign a piece of paper that basically, we are Englishmen. We are your subjects. If you care about your citizens, if you honor the principles of life, liberty, property, ladies and gentlemen, the Olive Branch Petition is a direct appeal to the king to pull back. Not because you are afraid of us, but to show mercy and respect to your citizens. The Olive Branch Petition is a request by all 13 counties for the English to pull back and then negotiate. What is the agreement of the Olive Branch? If the English will agree to negotiate, Massachusetts will basically back off their military stance, and we will try to work out a deal. However, ladies and gentlemen, the Olive Branch is a test. England will call it an ultimatum if the king refuses. If the king refuses to back off his military power, take this as a sign that the king is a tyrant. The king is out of control. The king has no more respect for the rule of law, and the 13 colonies will then unite behind Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, the other 12 colonies are hoping that the king will want to protect his people. The other 12 counties are hoping that the king will want to avoid bloodshed. If that is the case, the king will back off of Massachusetts, and the two parties will negotiate an agreement. If the king refuses to back off, if the bloodshed continues, that means Massachusetts is right. The king no longer cares about law and order, and they will reunite behind Massachusetts with the idea that the king has become a tyrant. January 1776. Can anyone try to put into words how is the king going to deal with that piece of paper? Ladies and gentlemen, what had the benevolent, wonderful king offered to the other 12? Mercy, forgiveness. And what did the other 12 choose to side with? Ladies and gentlemen, King George is not going to find any humor in this. He is not going to find any intelligence in this. He is going to find outright defiance. The other 12 counties were given absolute absolution. They had no penalty. They had no consequence. He gave you a free pass. And what do you return the favor? You basically smack the king in the face and say that they will stand behind Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, the king's response is very simple. All 13 counties are deemed in open rebellion. King George is very clear. You are either with me or you are against me. The king is not going to react well to the olive branch. The king does look at it as an ultimatum. It is a threat. It is a target. You are challenging the authority of a king. That will not be tolerated. What is important about this? Number one, the king is going to do two things. First, the king announces that he is going to begin to send Hessian mercenaries them later. Ladies and gentlemen, this raises lots of eyebrows. Hessians are German soldiers. If you need to, just write Germans next to the word Hessians. Germany at this time is still a relatively disorganized, divided country. It is just not united like France and England. And what has become common is they have a lot of very good soldiers that wage war in Germany a lot. And what they will do is they will fight for the highest bidder. Why is this raising eyebrows? Is because the king is basically paying mercenaries, hired killers, thugs, against his own people. Mercenaries are often hired to help in a war against your enemy, But generally, when they go into towns and villages, they take whatever they can to help, enrich, their payment. Next, the king says word to his army in Boston that the colonies are in open rebellion. He basically tells them that starting at this point, all 13 colonies will be punished, that the British Army in Boston is going to leave. It is going to go to Canada to resupply, and it will be reassigned. Please understand, that is going to have enormous significance. A couple of other items. I'm going to go chronologically right now. We're in January of 1776. What they're going to do. Hessian mercenaries are coming. The king technically has made the announcement that they are all in rebellion. Next item is some crackpot named Thomas Paine. He's going to write a small little pamphlet called Common Sense. There's something I love about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is like every other colonist English, but the problem is he'd only been in America for a couple of years. Thomas Paine had come over to America, and of course all of this hoopla and stuff began to begin. And folks, what you want to understand is as all of this is happening and the colonists are afraid and worrying and trying to decide what to do, Thomas Paine, who really is kind of an outsider, he had not been there long, he is going to sit down and write a pamphlet where he basically encourages the colonists of what to do. And in the pamphlet, he is basically going to argue 3 main points. Number 1, Thomas Paine is going to argue that the king doesn't care, that the king is not their protector. It's because a lot of people up to this point were blaming Parliament, they were blaming the Prime Minister, and people were arguing that if only the king knew, the king would take care of it, the king would fix it. And Thomas Paine is going to be very blunt and basically say that the king doesn't care. Number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why I love Thomas Paine. Each and every one of us go through our lives and we have a habit of not seeing things that happen every day. We get used to, he always does this, or she acts that way, or this is the way it is, and we get so used to it, we no longer question it. I not say that as a way to criticize you. As I talk about Thomas Paine, I think back to my own experiences in life, and I think back to times when I probably should have said something or acted, but we don't always. Ladies and gentlemen, the second thing Thomas Paine says is probably the most important. Thomas Paine is going to point out that in the 13 colonies, there is rights and freedoms and liberty that does not exist anywhere else in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Paine is going to point out that if you colonists decide to stand up to your mother, if your colonists decide to challenge England, it is not about taxes. It is not about sugar or tea. It should be about the idea that citizens have the right to govern themselves. It should be the right that people should be able to choose their own church. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Paine is the one who's going to smack people in the face and basically say, look at the things you have. At this point, if you do not stick up for them, the king is going to take them. The king is going to create a country where you do what he says and believe what he says. Thomas Paine is basically going to say you have something to fight for, you just don't know it. Ladies and gentlemen, the common people in America needed Thomas Paine and common sense to rise to the fact that this revolution was not about no taxation or representation. It is about representative government. It is about citizens that have the right to speak up. It is about freedoms that the people have. And that is what the people needed. Please understand, Common Sense sells over 150,000 copies. This is what will convince average, regular people what the conflict is about. Number 3. Again, number 3, some of us needed a smack in the face. You don't need England. This is where he points out boycotts. He points out the distance of the ocean. He points out in the past, remember all the times where you had to deal with problems and Mama never was there? You don't need her. You have grown big enough. You have grown strong enough. If the 13 of you learn to help each other. So ladies and gentlemen, that is Thomas Paine. That is common sense. What is the importance? Relevance. It begins to put out in the open independence. It begins to put out the idea that maybe the colonies have something worth fighting for. It begins to create conversations. Conversations that up until this time people were too afraid to say. What is the importance of common sense? This is kind of over here. Congress begins to start acting like a government. Congress will authorize the use of privateers. Congress will begin to open up relations with France and Spain. Congress encourages the colonies, bless you, to rip up their royal charters and create state fundamentals or constitutions. Please understand, by May, the 13 counties were acting like a government. The Second Continental Congress was making decisions. The only thing the counties had not done was discuss that final, last, drastic step of independence. In February, at a place called Dorchester Heights, the British Navy sailed on Boston. February, March, April, May, there are no British soldiers in the cities. They simply packed up and sailed away. They had not returned. Citizens were beginning to question, maybe England doesn't want to fight. Maybe England simply doesn't feel it's worth her time. Ladies and gentlemen, when I give you the next item, you want to be able to identify when the 13 counties are going to vote, discuss, and make the next decision. The British Army has left America. The next decision comes on June 7th. Again, if you know the date, wow, that's wonderful. If you say June 7th or know the name, then the event is made by a man named Richard Henry Lee. You could argue Richard Henry Lee is insignificant, and you could argue he's the bravest man in America. Richard Henry Lee, a very wealthy, prominent Virginian, is the man who stands up before Congress and formally proposes independence. Richard Henry Lee is the man who stands up before the counties and he proposes the separation from England. Richard Henry Lee is the man who first commits treason. For the next several weeks, the Congress debates what to do. Is it a wise decision? They have a lot of discussions. They discuss how this is going to look like. And as the men begin to discuss, they basically decide on two things. One, we need to have a vote. We need to have a vote for independence. We need to have a vote of whether or not we are going to do this. That's one. And number two, ladies and gentlemen, we need to create a document. We need to create a document that is going to tell the world what we are doing and why. That document is basically going to not only tell the world of our intent of independence, it is going to explain to the world what this new government will look like. Ladies and gentlemen, on July 2nd, 1776, the 13 colonies in Philadelphia will vote. And on July 2nd, 1776, the 13 colonies vote to declare independence. Does anybody want to question whether I'm wrong or have a funny or something doesn't make sense? Folks, didn't anybody notice that? Hasn't anybody figured it out yet? We celebrate the 4th of July. I mean, don't you guys realize that on the 4th of July, 1776 is the beginning of America? The vote on July 2nd was the vote for independence. The vote on July 4th is the vote to ratify the document. Ladies and gentlemen, 5 men will make the Declaration of Independence. If you want, I very quickly can tell you the 5 men who write it, because it's a pretty important document. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin, the most well known. Benjamin Franklin, the eldest statesman, and Thomas Jefferson, of course, was the youngest. Followed by John Adams, the second president of the United States, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Clearly, I would think Jefferson and Franklin are the ones I'd be the most likely to know. John Adams, Sherman, and Livingston, I'm not saying they're insignificant. I'm not saying that they don't have some relevance. But let's be honest, it's hard. 5 names is a lot. If you had to pick and choose, I would focus on the 2 most well known. Why is Jefferson given the most credit? Because it is generally argued he's the one who actually puts it into words. The other men gave suggestions. The other men were the ones who kind of came up with ideas. But it is generally believed that the person who actually sort of had the pen in his hand and wrote it was Thomas Jefferson. Ladies and gentlemen, the Declaration of Independence has 3 primary parts. You should know them. It is the Declaration of Independence. You should know them because this is still the document that kind of is the foundation of what our country stands for. Does anybody remember what the first part is? What? That'll be the second.
Life, liberty, property.
Folks, I've said it, I think I've said it out loud 4 or 5 times in class. All men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. For those of you who had trouble or did not like the first unit, remember the fundamental constitutions. Folks, they are not irrelevant. They are not insignificant. The Declaration of Independence, which is the guiding framework of this country, is based on life, liberty, and property.